what I want to do is I want to go over some of the things you might notice straight away when you first open up the updated IDE. There are a few things that I noticed as certainly as a Java person when I first started using IntelliJ 15. For example, in my Java tests in particular, it was pretty good at pointing out to me where I had duplicated code, which is a little bit alarming, but that's the way it goes. So here you can see it says, we found duplicated code in this file. If I press Alt-Enter, it will allow me to navigate to the duplicate. Now this will show duplicate code of over 5 lines of code. I can also configure it according to the way you configure any inspection. So I can turn it off, or I can tweak the inspection to sort of say, well, I don't really care about duplicate code in tests, for example, or I only care about it in a particular scope. Or I might want to set it from warning up to a more severe error. So like any inspection, it can be completely configured. You can get rid of it, of course, by refactoring out the duplicate code. This should be something that should be reasonably familiar to most people who've been using the refactoring tools anyway. Let's say we extract this into a method. Let's call it check iterable. And extract this out into a method. This is the only thing that changes between the code. So I'll put this into a parameter. And as per usual, IntelliJ IDEA will find the duplicate code and offer to replace it for you. So now I have 2 tests which are calling the same method, and so my duplicate code has been reduced to a single method which is called with 2 different parameters. Now something you might have noticed when I'm looking at this test is that I've got little run icons in the gutter, and it shows me that last time I ran this test, everything went green, everything's okay. Let me show you an example of a test where I haven't run it yet. So let's take a look at some arbitrary test. Here it shows me where I can that I can run this. So I can run it, I can debug it, I can run it with coverage. If I run it, then in my case, because this is a Gradle project, I get the standard option to run it as a Gradle or JUnit configuration. Once I've run it, then it will tell me that all the tests went green there. And then, of course, I can rerun a test from here. I can run individual tests or debug individual tests as well. Or not, if it completely ignores me. Let's try this one. Oh, I know why. I have a window that opens on my other monitor, which is not super useful. Okay, so now I have, I already had a number of different ways I could run tests or configurations, but this is just another one. And so what I found really useful about this is when I'm running my test, I can see the status of all my tests the last time they ran, or if perhaps I haven't run them. Obviously, if one of these tests fails, let's turn this to false, and then try running it. Then my icon is going to change to a failure icon. While we're on the subject of testing, let's have a look at the new UI for testing. So it's not so much a brand new UI, it's just an updated version of the UI. I'm going to run all the tests again so that we can see the results down here like we do. Now, previously, you could get the statistics for a test in a separate panel with a separate table telling you what time it took to run individual tests and so forth. Now, I get the time taken to run the tests in line with the actual tests themselves. So I can also do something like I can reorder the tests by time taken. So I can look at the long one and find out if I need to do something to make that take slightly less time, if that's the sort of thing that's interesting to me. One of the other things I can do with my updated test panel is I can now place this on the left or the right of the UI. I don't just always have to have it on the bottom. So if I put it on the, let me find it now. Oh no, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong place. I can move this to the right-hand side, and it will automatically figure out that now I'm running on the right. The best place to put the console is down underneath the tests themselves. So I have a bit more versatility around how I display my test results, depending on obviously screen layout and so forth. There are other things I can do with my test results. For example, I can export them. I can export them as HTML, XML. Obviously, this is useful for saving test results or for sharing specific results with the team, so on and so forth. And the other thing I can do is I can look at all the tests that I've run in the past when I ran them. And so I can reopen this and have a look at the test results. Let's pick a different sort of test. And so the test results I won't have to rerun the test in order to look at a previous set of test results. So I can see that test result and when it failed. One of the other major efforts here is to try and make this testing UI much more consistent across all the different frameworks and libraries that you're using. So for example, if you're running a JavaScript testing framework, you'll find it very similar and very familiar. So it's very easy to move from libraries and languages, and you get a similar sort of experience inside the IDE. And one final thing around running applications or tests, let me switch to another project. If I'm running a long-running service or a long-running test, let me start this one up. Then my run icon changes to a rerun icon so that it's more clear to me that I'm already running this service, and if I want to run it again, I will shut this service down and restart it. That's particularly useful for an application like this one where I have 4 or 5 different services and I quite often want to restart individual services. I don't necessarily want to start a brand new version. And there's one more area I want to cover in this section, which is if I look at find in path, then there's now the ability to preview the search results. So let's say I want to search for all lambdas in my project for some reason. Then in the preview tab, I can see everywhere where I'm using the little lambda chevron, which might not always be an actual lambda. So I can kind of flick through, take a look, and see if this is the thing I want to navigate to, or if this is perhaps misleading because in this case it's a regular expression, not a lambda. And then of course I can navigate directly to that. One last thing around UI improvements, which I particularly liked, is particularly since I'm actually colorblind, there's an option to change the UI to be much more friendly to colorblind people like me. So I can change it to something where it will be less dependent upon reds and greens to show me the differences between different things in the UI. I've been playing with this a little bit myself. It's quite interesting as a colorblind person to see how many cues you've been missing because things were shown in red and green and orange and you weren't aware of them. So if you are colorblind, I highly recommend turning on this setting. And if there's anything that you want to see, then feeding back to JetBrains and seeing how we can improve this particular feature. I think this is really interesting and I'm going to be using it a lot more from now on. So that's kind of the brief intro to editor and UI changes that they should be fairly obvious to you as soon as you start using the UI. As always, we have a number of improvements to the debugger, so particularly around lambda expressions. So let's have a quick look at what that looks like. So here, for example, I have a stream. This would be a fairly common use of stream where I have a stream and a number of lambda expressions going into a number of my stream operations. Now, over here on the gutter on the left-hand side, I can actually see a little lambda icon and it shows me the type of the lambda. Now, I find this particularly useful because now I've started using lambdas in Java 8 a lot more. You find a lot of the types kind of disappear because the compiler can work them out. But as a developer, you can't always work them out. And this is useful. This is telling me that map takes a function. It's telling me that filter takes a predicate. So I can see that in the IDE really easily. Now I might want to debug this lambda. So I'm going to look specifically at this particular lambda. I can either choose to put the breakpoint up at the top level, so I can breakpoint when the stream is initiated, or just on the individual lambda. Now this is much more useful. I mean, that's fairly useful. It's even more when you have more than one lambda on a line. So if I place a breakpoint here, then I can put a breakpoint on any one of these individual lambdas. So let's say I put a breakpoint on this one. Now let's navigate to the test and try and debug this. So now you can see the breakpoint stops on the map operation, specifically the lambda, to turn it into a lowercase letter or lowercase word. And as I step through, then I see each time that lambda is called with a different word. One of the other things that we've implemented is the ability to run to cursor inside a lambda. So if I put my cursor on a lambda in the filter method, for example, and then I run this, oops, and then I run to breakpoint, that would be useful. It will break in that lambda where I've put my cursor. So this gives me a lot more flexibility around debugging lambda expressions, particularly in stream operations where you have a number of different lambda operations. And I might be wanting to see the inputs at any particular stage of my stream pipeline. So let's let this finish. And I'll finally show you the next change in the debugger that I want to show you. So one of the other new features is, let's debug this again, but this time we'll stop closer to the beginning of the method. Now what I might want to do, especially if I'm debugging a more complicated chain of method calls, what I might want to do is I might want a particular method to finish early and return a set value. So here I've got a new feature which allows force return. So it won't evaluate any more of the rest of this method. It will return at this point. IntelliJ is going to ask me what value do you want to return, because this is supposed to return a moody message. So let's say I return a new moody message. Oh, and then it will also give me the autocomplete that I expect to have. Now if I put a null in there, it'll carry on running, but my test will fail because I've got a null pointer. So this is particularly useful for, instead of having to tweak variables or values inside a specific class or method in order to force a method to return something specifically, I can do the force return and tell it which value to return. One final thing, which is not specifically around the debugger, but does kind of help with understanding what's going on inside the code, is the ability to evaluate the expression types inside a lambda. So here I can say, I'm going to take the S2 lowercase expression, and it's going to tell me that this is a string type. This was available in Scala before, but now it's available for Java 8 lambdas and for Groovy as well. So again, like the other tweaks and changes, like the ability to debug lambdas, like this showing you what type the lambda is, I just get a lot more feedback from the IDE about what's going on inside my Java 8 specific features. There's also been a number of changes around the version control side of things. Some of them are just small improvements to help with our workflow. Some of them are new features that we didn't have previously. So firstly, I'm going to look at rebasing. Obviously, different teams like to work in different ways. So not everyone uses rebase, not everyone uses merge. But what we've done is we've turned rebase into a feature which is at a sort of par with merging. So for example, I'm on this branch to rebase. Now, if I click on this branch here, my IntelliJ 15 branch, I can rebase onto this branch the same way as I could have merged onto it previously. So if I press this, it should allow me to rebase straight away. I get the same functionality if I want to, I can do it from the log as well. So for example, I can do the rebase in the VCS log too. So it just basically allows you to rebase the same way that you can merge with the same sort of ease of use. This also works if you've got a project with multiple VCS routes, then you can also rebase across those too. So this can be quite a powerful feature, particularly for more complex projects than this one. One of the other new features is the ability there are various different diff views that you have inside IntelliJ IDEA. Sometimes you're comparing against an older version of the file. Sometimes you're doing a diff on check-in. And we've made those different types of diffs more consistent so that you can actually edit inside the diff viewer, so that you can edit your local file there in the diff viewer. So that's one small change. Another thing is we've added the ability to undo when you're in the middle of a merge. And then we've added two new features for other systems. So for example, you can shelve in perforce. So when you do shelf, you're not necessarily just saving on your local shelf. If you've got a perforce project, you can shelve in perforce, so it's much safer, much less likely to lose those changes. And another feature we've added is the ability to manage patches in mercurial queues as well. As always, frameworks aren't standing still while we create the IDE, so we've added additional support for updated frameworks. So IntelliJ IDEA keeps up to date with frameworks as they go. So for example, Spring 4.2, we've added coding assistance for Spring 4.2 features. We've added coding assistance for Spring Boot features, and we've improved the project wizard for Spring Boot as well. There will be a separate webinar later on around the Spring specific features, so I don't want to spend too much time looking at those because they are a big enough project in their own right to have their own webinar. In terms of Grails 3, we have support for Grails 3 now. The Android users will be very happy to hear that the updates in Android Studio 1.3 and 1.4 have been merged into IntelliJ 15 as well. But the two features I specifically want to look at and demonstrate today are around Archillion testing and the Docker support. So let's have a quick look at Archillion. I shall switch to one of my projects which has the right setup. So here I've got an Archillion test, as you can see. And as with the previous tests, I have the ability to run these tests with different configurations. So I'm going to run this one. Unlike the other project, which just offered me Gradle and JUnit, I can run this with Archillion JUnit if I want to. So I choose this option, and it allows me to choose the container to run. So here I'm going to configure a new Archillion container. I'm going to use an embedded WellDE container. So let's OK that. Select this container and run it. Now, one of the advantages of running tests this way is that I can run it in a bunch of different containers in a fairly lightweight way. The IDE is going to take care of downloading the right dependencies, of setting up the right environment. I don't have a lot of configuration to manage for this. I don't have to use Maven or Gradle to download all the right dependencies. The IDE is going to do this for me. And you can see, as per usual, it's giving me what I'd expect to see in test results, whether this test passed or failed. If I want to, I can configure those. I can configure more of those configurations for Archillion as well. And so that's kind of the additional support we've added for Archillion. Let's have a look at Docker. So Docker obviously has been one of those rising trends over the last few years and shows certainly no sign of diminishing. So as per usual, we are adding as many new features as we can to support developers who are using these sorts of things. So I have Docker up and running. I'm going to connect to it as an application server. So what I did is I needed to enable the Docker plugin first. So I've got Docker integration enabled. This is a plugin. It doesn't necessarily come built into IntelliJ to begin with. I've also had to add a Docker cloud deployment. This is all covered in an earlier webinar around the new Docker features which came in IntelliJ 14.1. So I don't want to cover that in too much detail, but the point is that I can see Docker down here. One of the new features is the ability to create a new container from an image. So I'm going to create a container here. Here I have all the options for creating this container. I can tweak this exactly how I want to. So for example, I can define my port bindings, I can define links, I can define my environment variables. I can do all of this through the UI if I want to. If I'm used to doing things the command line way, then I can pass in my command line options here. So I can copy these from wherever I was doing my command line configuration in the past, and IntelliJ IDEA will parse these into something more suitable for the configuration here. And obviously I can also select a JSON file here as well. So I can select my Docker JSON file. I can use a combination of my command line arguments and my UI defined arguments. And once I've done that, it will deploy it and run it. And I can attach this session and type into my console. We have full support for Docker Toolbox now, and in fact, that's actually what I'm running here on this machine. So however you configure Docker, you should be able to get up and running inside IntelliJ IDEA without too many problems. So far, we've been kind of fairly Java specific with this, but as usual, we've also added support for other languages too. So for Groovy, we've added support for the builder annotation. So this allows you to add the @builder annotation onto the top of one of your Groovy classes and have IntelliJ IDEA recognize this and provide you with autocomplete for things like the builder methods, the setters and the getters and so forth. For in terms of Scala, in terms of Scala, we have a number of improvements, including macro expansion extractor. Like Java, we can debug to stop at lambda expressions. We have got postfix completion for Scala. If you haven't had a look at postfix completion, it's a really good way to allow you to continue typing. So instead of having to move your cursor around the lines to perhaps extract a variable or so forth, with postfix completion, you can add things onto the end of your line and have it automatically create code for you. We've also added support for inline refactoring to type aliases. There is a number of detailed blog information about the Scala improvements in IntelliJ IDEA 15, which are available on the blog. And of course, Kotlin being the JetBrains JVM language baby, this is the M14 release is bundled in with IntelliJ IDEA 14. The plugin is part of IntelliJ IDEA 15. It's no longer an additional plugin, it's all built in, part of the IDE. This, I guess, is kind of part of the whole ramp up and process of getting us ever closer to that 1.0 Kotlin release. So this should make it super easy to get up and running with Kotlin if it's something you do want to try playing with. It's all fully supported inside the IDE now. And for the web frameworks, we haven't forgot about the web frameworks. As always, we're adding a lot of support for the web technologies too. So we've added support in TypeScript for TypeScript 1.6 features like intersection types, type guard functions, local types, and also integration with TF-lint. For Polymer 1.0, we've added basic support, but the thing I want to show you is our support for React. So I'll open up a React project. So like any other supported language, what you get with IntelliJ IDEA if you're using React is that you get autocomplete with all your expected features. So it makes it much easier to develop with this library once you've got it all set up. So it will auto suggest to you a bunch of things which are suitable for you. I can also navigate through these things. So I can command click through to find where these things have been defined. And I can also do things like I can look at which parameter types are expected in these method calls too. So again, it gives me some help and some guidance. If I wanted to, if I was creating this myself, it also gives me auto completion to allow me to select these custom types. So these things, comment box, and so forth, have been defined inside this file. And IntelliJ IDEA is giving me support, allowing me to select these here if I want to. I can also see, for these custom types here, I can also see the definition. If I do, let me have a look, Control Alt I, then I can look at the definition here, or I can click through and it will take me to where this was defined. It also gives me autocomplete on my HTML for the React specific attributes. So I can do, for example, class name. It will automatically allow me to use those, even for HTML inside the JavaScript. And so if that's support for HTML inside the JavaScript, then obviously we also have support for JavaScript inside our HTML here. So I can type this and I can say raw markup, and it will give me my autocomplete for that too. So I get the full IDE experience, regardless of whether I'm trying to write HTML or JavaScript or whatever, for React inside IntelliJ IDEA 15. And finally, before we go on to any further questions or drill down into something in any more detail that people want to see, we have updated database tools as well. There have been a lot of improvements in the IDE to improve the way that you can work with your database inside your IDE. I particularly find this really interesting because it allows you to do everything inside the IDE without having to leave and go to another tool. So let's have a look at an example of this. If we go back to my Java EE tutorial, I can see my databases window. So we've had the databases window for some time. The window is not necessarily new, but what I can do is, some of the things that have changed is the data sources and drivers window here has been modified to make it a bit easier to use, make it a bit prettier. I think most interestingly to me is the fact that you can modify your table right here. So I can use a UI to create the changes that I want to see. So I can remove this column if I want to. I can add a new column, let's say, I don't know, favorite book. I get autocomplete, so I know that I'm not mistyping something. So I get a new column here. And you can see the SQL script too. You can also edit this if you want to. And it will take the edits that you've made on your SQL script, and it will apply those when you're doing the refactoring. You can also add indices. So yes, you can also add indices. So if I want to, I can add an index on, let's say I'm going to want to search on last name. So I can add an index here on last name. And I can add foreign keys as well. So I can add a new foreign key with a target table, which I actually can't do in this demo because I did not create a second table. But it is a foreign key to a second table, and you get all that extra autocomplete to help you do that. So if I delete that and run this, I should get, it should remove one. Oh, look, I've done too much in one go. Let's cancel this and try it again. It would be no fun if we didn't see any errors. So let's be less ambitious and just try and remove these two columns here. Okay, then we get those changes come through here. Now let's have a look at the table editor. Now, IntelliJ IDEA 15 has added a lot of support for being able to talk much more usefully to databases, so that we can have more information about what the database looks like, what the table looks like, all the things that you as a developer might want to do with that database, which allows it to work much more quickly in terms of doing things like bringing up the data in that table, or allowing you to alter stuff in the database. So it's not really something I can specifically demo, other than it should work faster than it used to. We have specific support for MySQL, PostgreSQL, and Microsoft SQL. And oh yes, and another new feature that you can do is when you bring up the table editor, I can do a search. Obviously, SQL is kind of designed to do searching, but if I've got my first page of results or some set of results, I can also search these results for something which I'm particularly looking for. So here I can find myself. And finally, let's bring up a file that actually uses the SQL. So let's say we have this SQL here. I can run this in a console. And so I've run this, and I can see the results of it here. If I try and run it a second time, it gives me the option to rerun it inside this, or perhaps open a new console. This kind of super useful, obviously, if you want to run a bunch of different queries or variations on the queries, so that you can see perhaps what the differences are. So let's order by ID desk, and try rerunning that. Oops. Or not. This is what happens when you try and wing it. You're going to get an error. But anyway, you get the idea. If I was running a different query or a variation on the same query, I could see the results of those two queries side by side, so I could see what they look like. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I believe that is the end of our introduction to IntelliJ IDEA 15. Thanks a lot.